After the design process, we made a couple of small maquettes of the larger piece in wax. We were luckily just putting up a studio on our farm, which we could add a couple of meters to in order to get the sculpture in. The first stage of doing the big sculpture was to put up an armature, a steel armature, to support the clay, and we used the small models to reference all the points on the large sculpture with plumb lines and a grid. We then used aluminium wire to get the shapes of the animals before we could start adding clay. This is a really exciting bit where all the forms start to appear in the wire and the clay, and you actually see the sculpture starting to emerge. Sometimes when you've been modelling for a little while, you actually need to change something, and that requires cutting the armature inside. It's really important to keep the sculpture alive, to keep going back and drawing inspiration from the original drawings and concepts. It was fantastic working on this project, not only with my mum, Laura McKean, and my husband, Charlie, but also with two sculptors, Edward Murray and Hiromi Shinto, who were actually students back at the academy that I set up in 2000, and it was lovely to work with them on this project. We really wanted the sculpture to be aspirational, not only in its ecological subject matter, but also in its shape and form, and we needed it to work from every viewpoint on the site. Therefore, we did have to keep standing back to see the effects of the geometry of the lines and the shapes forming. We collected lots of different imagery of site-specific animals and plants to reference, because as we developed the sculpture, we had to keep changing the detail to work with the greater whole. Once we have the large shapes of the sculpture in, it's actually really fun working into the detail. At that point, it's a lot about kind of colour and texture, and getting the sort of kind of the personalities of the animals and all the different plants and things forming, but at the same time making all that detail work with the sculpture as a whole. With sculptures particularly of this size, apart from the creative side, there's also a whole technical aspect to deal with, and we worked with engineers and 3D scanners to build models and drawings to ensure that the strength and loading of the large amount of steelwork inside the sculptures was correct for the environmental conditions that they were going to be sited in. Back in the studio, the finished clays are going through one of their most critical processes, which is having the rubber mould taken of the clay sculptures, which are then destroyed. The first part of the process is to put layers of silicon, liquid silicon rubber onto the sculptures, which harden. This is then divided into sections, and each section has a hard resin and fiberglass jacket put on to support the rubber. These pieces are then taken off the clay sculpture, and the imprint of the clay is left in the negative mould. The rubber moulds then go to the bronze foundry, where they go through the next stage, which is having a positive wax cast taken from the moulds. The wax is painted into the moulds, and it's quite thin. It's the thickness that the final bronze cast is going to be. They also put some kind of tubes of wax onto the rubber called runners, and this later on, when it's being cast into the bronze, is how the liquid molten bronze pours to the extremities before it cools. The wax pieces then have another mould made from them. This time it's a hard ceramic shell mould, which is heat proof, and it's applied on the inside and the outside of the wax when it's liquid. When this hardens, the wax is melted out, and in this cavity is where the liquid molten bronze is poured. The cast bronze pieces are then welded together around the steel support structure, and using a mix of hand and power tools, the weld lines are worked to bring back all the detail of the original clay sculpture. Finally, the finished bronze is coloured using a large flame and chemicals to give the traditional bronze colour. We worked with two fantastic foundries. The house martins were cast by the Loss Foundry and the spiral by HVH Foundry. The 6-metre spiral sculpture on its side required a purpose-built transportation frame, before being lifted by one of the biggest cranes in Europe, 150 feet in the air, to its final site. The Housemartin sculpture installation had its own challenges as well. The sculpture is 7 meters tall, as it was to be installed in the canal basin. A temporary dam was built, so fortunately we didn't have to put our diving gear on. It was really fantastic to finally unveil these sculptures on this beautiful site. It was a subject so close to our hearts. St George have done an incredible job transforming the old gasworks, creating new canals, waterways, green spaces, all providing space for nature and encouraging wildlife back onto the site. Finally, just a huge thank you to all the people with their skill and their enthusiasm that have made these sculptures possible.